Good evening. My name is Jonathan Mavroidis. I'm with the Richard Nixon Foundation. Before we start this evening, I just want to introduce a couple of special guests. We got the speaker's wife, Gloria Gellman. The president of the Nixon Foundation, Bill Barabalt. The director of the Nixon Presidential Library, Mike Elsie. The president's younger brother, Ed. Mary Roosevelt, a prominent member of the Roosevelt family. Ruth Shannon, a prominent civic leader in Whittier. Sandy Quinn, a board director and former president of the Nixon Foundation. Hubert Perry, a friend of President Nixon in college and a friend and supporter of his campaigns and throughout the years. 102 years old. Ruth Ann Sergestrom Moriarty of the first family of Orange County and a member of the Sergestrom family. Just a couple of upcoming events to announce. Next week, on September 10th, we're going to have Vice President Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, his daughter. They're the authors of Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America, and they'll be speaking at 7 p.m. Also next week, we have our annual 9/11 Remembrance Ceremony at 11 a.m. Very patriotic, very moving ceremony that we do every year, so please, if you can, please attend that as well. Today's lecture kicks off our Nixon Legacy Author Series for this fall. Next week, we have Evan Thomas. He's going to talk about his book, Being Nixon, A Man Divided. That's September 8th at 7 p.m. On September 17th at 7 p.m., this is a Thursday, we have a fellow from Oxford, Roham Alvandi, and he's going to talk about his book, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Shah, the United States and Iran in the Cold War. Very relevant because around that time, I think his vote is going to go up for the Iran nuclear deal. Neil Ferguson has a new biography about Henry Kissinger. It's called The Idealist, 1923 to 1968, and this will be on Tuesday, October 6th at 7 p.m. And Douglas Brinkley and Luke Nichter have a new book called The Nixon Tapes, their second volume of the Nixon Tapes, and this will be on October 19th at 7 p.m. You can check out these and other events at nixonfoundation.org, where you can also become a member and get significant discounts. So now on to our speaker. Our speaker tonight is pretty brilliant. Irv Gellman is an author of books on 4 presidents. He's taught at UC Irvine, Chapman University, and now at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. He authored a book on President Nixon's years in Congress. It's called The Contender, and he's currently working on a book about the Nixon-Kennedy election. His most recent book is the subject of the talk tonight. It's called The President and the Apprentice, Eisenhower and Nixon from 1952 to 1961. It's a monument of research and scholarship. I think the endnotes and bibliography alone are 300 pages, so he's put a lot of work into it. Ladies and gentlemen, a great scholar and a great American, Irv Gellman.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I start, one of the things I'd like to do is reintroduce Ruth Ann Sergestrom Moriarty, who without her kindnesses and her generosity to my wife and myself, this book would never be written. She is as good as it gets, and if you read the dedication that she has in the gentleman that's coming, this is her book, and it is her book with my thanks, and I appreciate it. In addition to that, what I appreciate is all of you who come. It's beyond thankful for some of the people that I know that are here and I haven't seen in years. Is Ben and Barbara here? Ben and Barbara, could you do me a favor and stand up? Barbara, can you stand up, please? I can't mention everybody, but these are two of the best people that I know anywhere. Barbara has put up with Ben for I don't know how many years, and always looks at him the same way that my wife looks at me and says, I can't believe, Ben, that you did that. But he's still doing it, he's still here, and both of you guys, you are, the epitome of what is good in, the county and the state and anywhere that folks that are good and gracious can be. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for helping me out. The check won't bounce? By the way, that is typical Ben. When he sits down, Barbara will hit him. What I would like to start off with, if you don't mind, is a story. Not true, but it's a story. Richard Nixon and Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, didn't like one another. They may have hated one another. They may have gone even lower than that. They both may have been in Dante's ninth circle of hell. But the story that is told is done for one reason and one reason only. And it's to prove that both Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower didn't get along for a reason. And the reason was if they couldn't get along, their party couldn't get along, and they themselves as representatives of the Republican Party could not get along. And the people that write this, I hope you're not shocked, are Democrats. And it's a story that is done purposefully. It's not a story that's done because of some mistake. It's a story that's done because if you are a Democrat and you're partisan, or if you are of a liberal persuasion and you're partisan, the story fits. It is a good story of where to start with the animosity within the Republican Party. And what's a better place to start with animosity within the Republican Party than Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon? It may make sense to folks that don't do the work, but after 20 years and 3 million pages of documents, and reading as much as I could and interviewing as many people as I could, the story is just the opposite. So what I decided to do was to begin with one of the seminal moments in Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower. And it was called the Fun Crisis. And it dealt with a checker speech, both of which were supposed to show how badly Nixon and Eisenhower got along, and in addition to that, how evil Richard Nixon was. Because, as his brother knows better than most, you have to make Richard Nixon evil before he was even born. There is a lady that wrote a book called Richard Nixon by Fawn Brody. And I kid you not. On the fly jacket it says that even before he was born, he was a liar. I mean, that kind of stuff is crazy, but that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. So what I want to do is I want to tell you what really happened during the Fun Crisis and take you through it. as logically as I can, without being a Democrat, without being a Republican, without being a socialist or an anarchist or anything, but just give you the fact pattern the way it occurred and see if what I'm telling you makes sense. And the first thing that I want to say is the campaign really started on September 17th, 1952, with Nixon chugging out of the Los Angeles train station and going up to the inner valleys in California and then up further on. As he was going on, there was this rumor. Hard to believe it was planted, but there was a rumor that Richard Nixon had a slush fund. Gee, how many times have we heard the venality of somebody having a slush fund? That's just terrible. And in his slush fund, secret rich man's trust fund keeps Nixon in style far beyond his salary. That's the banner headline. If any of you wish to read the article, there's nothing in there about a secret man's trust fund. There's nothing about millionaires. And there's nothing about Richard Nixon living beyond his style of life. But if you look just at that, that's pretty bad stuff. Why in the world would people believe that? And the answer is simple. The Democrats were running Adlai Stevenson against a 5-star general who was probably the singular best-known man in the world, Dwight Eisenhower. So they were searching for anything that they could use to somehow debilitate the 1952 campaign. And debilitating the 52 campaign was real simple. If Richard Nixon has this secret fund and is using it to live beyond his standard of living, get rid of him. Have him fired. And the man that demanded he be fired, again, I hope this is not shocking to you, was the chairman of the DNC. Now, why not? If I were the chairman of the DNC and I had something I thought was wonderful to work over my opponent, I would use it. And he certainly did. He called for Richard Nixon to be fired. Of course, there was a couple of problems. First problem, there was nothing that said anybody could get rid of the Vice President of the United States. Two, there was nothing that said that Dwight Eisenhower could get rid of Richard Nixon. And like so many other problems, when you have a ticket, if you did get rid of Richard Nixon as vice president, then you would have to start all over again, find another vice presidential candidate that the people would be happy with. Think about the morass that you would have to go through to do that. It would be virtually a war zone. So they have this story out there on September 18th. And the other thing that was a huge problem, I'm sure that some of you have heard of cell phones. There were no cell phones in 1952. You had two men running separate campaigns on separate trains that didn't stop at the same time, and they couldn't get in touch with each other at the same time. So here's Dwight Eisenhower moving along, who doesn't even hear about the charge of the secret fund until the next morning. And here's Richard Nixon going along, figuring, so what? This is the normal partisan stuff we have to deal with. Nothing's going to happen. Well, all of a sudden, there are movements. Get rid of Richard Nixon for doing this evil thing. Richard Nixon doesn't know what to do. How in the world do you respond to somebody wanting to get rid of you? And again, to go back and fade back, the fable is that Dwight Eisenhower wanted to remove Richard Nixon from the ticket, and quietly, behind the scenes, with stealth, talked about getting rid of him. There's only one problem. It never happened. Dwight Eisenhower never made one mention of Richard Nixon being removed from the ticket. It never happened. And yet, that is the story that you hear. The story is false. The story has no reality, but most of the people write about it. And as you will see in a little bit, it really is nutty how the make-up becomes fact when it's really fiction. So here is Richard Nixon chugging up towards Washington on his train, getting nailed for having the secret fund. And at the same time, here's Dwight Eisenhower traveling on his train in the Midwest. And as Nixon is going up the spine of the West Coast, there are people standing out there. Again, I know you'll be underwhelmed, but they were Democrats who were saying, get rid of him. Where is the money, Richard? What are you doing? How are you living with this kind of taint on your life? Now, for some reason, during this story, Adlai Stevenson, who is running against Dwight Eisenhower, doesn't say anything. People start to wonder, why isn't Adlai Stevenson attacking Richard Nixon for being this guy with a secret fund? And again, this may surprise you, but Adlai Stevenson had a fund. Not only did he have a fund, but he had a fund 10 times the size of Richard Nixon. Now, I read the authorized biography of Stevenson by John Bartlow Martin, where he talks about how he used this fund on really important things, like one of his son's birthday parties. Does that sound a little strange to you, where this man would be using a trust fund for his son's birthday party? Richard Nixon had to explain in detail that this fund wasn't meant for anything. And by the way, the fund was $18,235. He couldn't even write a check on the fund. It was in somebody else's name. The only thing that Richard Nixon could do was send invoices in to Dana Smith, who was the trustee, and Dana Smith wrote the check. Again, I know this may be somewhat surprising, but none of them added to Nixon's salary. None of them helped Nixon have a maid. None of them bought clothes for Richard Nixon at Neiman Marcus. All of the things that were done under this fund with, by the way, a very, very detailed fiduciary, which means if he did wrong, he went to the pokey. All of those funds were accounted for. Would you be surprised to know that Adlai Stevenson's fund was never revealed? I tried to find the records for the fund, and somehow they had disappeared. So nobody knows to this day where the records are for Adlai Stevenson. But everybody knows the details of what happened with Richard Nixon's fund. Well, the long and the short of the story is that Richard Nixon had to make sure that Price Waterhouse, at that time a huge accounting firm, went through the fund and then said, it's clean. There's nothing wrong with it. In addition, Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, a big Los Angeles law firm, was to go through the spending and say, did Nixon do anything wrong? And Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher said, this is as pure as a driven snow. So all of a sudden, there is no fund controversy. But in spite of that, Richard Nixon is forced to make sure that he's not only as pure as the driven snow, he's purer than the driven snow. And he has to give a speech on television. And that speech was called the Checker speech. Now, if you read about the Checker speech in just about every book, you will find out the word that is used most often is maudlin. And for those of you that don't know what maudlin means, maudlin doesn't sound good. And maudlin isn't good. It is a bad speech. It is a speech based on schmaltz that really doesn't mean anything. It's just a whitewash. And Richard Nixon gave this speech, and because it was such an awful speech that is interpreted by various people, you would think that most of the people that wrote in about the speech, and there were only about 3 million people that wrote in about the speech. Thank goodness for the lady sitting over there, Beverly Lindy, cataloged 25,000 letters. Of the 25,000 letters, 8 were negative. 8 were negative. And yet the speech was a failure. Now, again, I know that this probably won't surprise you. Richard Nixon remained on the ticket. So if the speech was as bad as it was, and Nixon was as evil as he was, how in the world did he survive it? Nobody answers that question. And the reason why nobody answers the question is because it never happened. It just sounded the way people wanted it to sound. And when I wrote this book, the introduction of the book, I tried to make as impartial and as antiseptic as I could. But people simply lied. Some of my friends who wrote blurbs for various books that I wrote simply were disingenuous. They simply did not tell the story the way it should have been told. And that was that Nixon had the largest TV audience up to that time for a political speech, and it was gangbusters. Do any of you ever have Eureka moments where all of a sudden you say, wow, that's really something wonderful? Well, as a historian, looking at a few million documents, you very seldom have a Eureka moment. And if I can figure out how to use this, this is a letter from Alan Lowell, written in late November 1956. You are all familiar with the term provenance. If you aren't, provenance means giving somebody the background to some important event that is occurring. And in the letter, for those of you that can't read it, it says, "Dear Vice President Nixon, this is a copy of the 7 pages of notes that Dwight Eisenhower took as he watched your speech at the Cleveland Auditorium on September 23rd, 1952. Eisenhower watched the speech in the manager's room at the Cleveland Auditorium. He made notes. Now, once more, the story, and again, this is the story. As Dwight Eisenhower was watching the speech, he was so angry that he took his pencil and stabbed it into the pad he was looking at and tore the paper and wrote awful things about Richard Nixon. Any of you see any rips? Any rips? Rips? How about maybe even a little mini tear? Reps? Sounds really good, doesn't it? Only I found that document. The reason why nobody else did is it comes from a series at the Nixon Library here called the 320 series. The 320 series is 847 boxes. You know, who's counting? It amounts to about 1.5 million pages. You'll never guess who's the only one ever to go through every page. I stumbled across this and I went, whoa, I can't believe this. And do you know why nobody else ever saw that? Because what they did in historical terms is what's called cherry picking. They looked at those documents that they thought would give Nixon the worst possible position. So rather than go from A, box 1, to Z, box 847, they went to box A, Sherman Adams, box B, so-and-so, box C, box E, Dwight Eisenhower, box R, Nelson Rockefeller, box whatever. To show you how bad it was, I looked at the last 50 boxes that nobody else had ever looked at. I don't know how many of you swim, but I wore swimmer's goggles. I wore a face mask. I had a smock in front of me, and I had something to clean them off because nobody had looked at those boxes ever. Nobody was in the room that I was in because nobody could stand being in the room I was in because of all the dust. I had to leave the room every 30 minutes because I couldn't stand the smell. But think about it. The obligation that I have standing in front of you is to be the best I can be. And the only way I know how to be the best I can be is doing the work. If you're going to have a preconceived notion of what goes on, why bother? Some of the people that I have written about, not in regard to this, but in regard to other things, and again, I hope none of you are upset or embarrassed or whatever. Stephen Ambrose wrote a big biography of Dwight Eisenhower. Stephen Ambrose wrote a big biography of Richard Nixon, 3 volumes. And in it, Dwight Eisenhower is said in one meeting of legislative leaders telling a Bobby Jones series of nigger jokes. Now, that's pretty awful. Sitting in front of a whole series of people giving derogatory comments on black people. You know, I have some skill at this. I was a white dean at a black university. So I think I'm pretty sensitive to this kind of stuff. And I said, you know, I looked at all those legislative leader things. I don't remember that. So I called up the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, and I said, will you guys do me a favor and scan those meetings? You'll never guess what came back. It never happened. It wasn't in any notes. So I decided to take the next step and said to the Eisenhower people, are you sure? Are there any kind of ancillary files to this? And it came back, no. Is that the end of the story? Maybe not. Taylor Branch wrote a book called Parting the Waters, the first in his series on Martin Luther King Jr. Won the Pulitzer Prize. And in it, he takes Stephen Ambrose's story that never happened and changes it. I mean, he could even copy well. So that's the kind of thing that I am dealing with on a regular basis. And it's sad. It does not make me happy to stand in front of you and say that some of my colleagues are not doing what they should, but they aren't. And for some reason, for Ed Nixon, this has got to fry you. I mean, to think that, it's one thing to criticize your brother for real things, but for things that never happened, and then not only never happened, but are made never to never happen, that's insane. I don't know how they do it. Well, the fact is that Eisenhower writes this speech after he sees Nixon give the checker speech on television. He goes and gives a speech in the Cleveland Auditorium, and he says, I've seen some really fine men do some really wonderful things. But this Richard Nixon is the man that I want to be my vice president. And you scratching your heads and saying, it doesn't sound like Eisenhower hates the guy, does it? Not to me, it doesn't. So from there, Eisenhower sends Nixon a letter. And in the letter, Eisenhower writes Nixon saying, I will meet you in Wheeling, West Virginia. Congratulations on your speech. I cannot make a decision of what's going on, but I will, to the best of my ability, give you my imprimatur that you will remain on the ticket. Eisenhower meets Nixon in Wheeling, West Virginia. Nixon's plane lands. Eisenhower rushes up to the plane, walks in, and says, "You're my boy," as Richard Nixon breaks down and cries. I know that all of you are historians. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know, but Eisenhower and Richard Nixon win the presidency and the vice presidency in 1952. And the people that didn't like Eisenhower as president of Columbia University because he was a military guy, not only were unhappy with Eisenhower at Columbia, but were even more unhappy when he beat Stevenson badly in 1952. And they not only were unhappy with that, but in 1956, Eisenhower won by a landslide. So they were really unhappy. So what did they do? They wrote history books based on wannabe history. Not what happened, but the way they wanted it to happen. I read one manuscript by James McGregor Burns, who ran on the Democratic ticket in 1958, that said Eisenhower barely beat Stevenson in 1956. I wrote in the margin in Jimmy's manuscript, I said, 9.7 million votes is not barely. I wrote him also and said, Jimmy, please don't publish this. Jimmy never talked to me again. But in the book called Running Alone, he did put down a very pleasant acknowledgement to me. Irwin Gellman read this. Boom, that was the end of it. So when you don't tell the story based on what really happened, you get this stuff. I want to end with one small little thing which gives you some additional story. One of the big problems with Chequers and the Chequers speech and the reaction is Dwight Eisenhower, because he was responsible for millions of lives, looked at something, and once it was done, it was over. When he writes about the Chequers speech in his memoirs, Mandate for Change, he spends 4 or 5 pages on it. Richard Nixon spends a whole chapter on it. And he is very upset of what happened and what happened with Chequers and what Eisenhower did. And the problem with much of the stuff that is written by both of these guys is they may cross in the night, but they're never together. So what I tried to do in the book was to put what Eisenhower was doing, what Stevenson was doing, what Nixon was doing, what Truman was doing, and all the rest of them, so you found out how the story interlocked. And the nature of just the checker story that I'm telling you is repeated time after time after time. I just want to do one last thing. You all know, especially Ed Nixon knows, that his brother saw a psychiatrist. Well, I got the psychiatrist's medical files. During the vice presidency, Arnold Hutschnecker saw Richard Nixon 8 times. Now, for any of you in the audience that are either crazy and or psychiatrists, and may also be crazy, 8 times I don't think makes for a psychotherapist. In addition to that, Arnold Hutschnecker went before Congress in November of 1973 and was asked the same 2 questions in the House and the Senate under the pain of perjury. And the questions were, Dr. Hutschnecker, did you ever treat Nixon for psychiatric problems? The answer was no. The same question was asked in the House. The other question was asked, Dr. Hutschnecker, did you ever treat Richard Nixon for psychological problems? The answer was no. I'm not sure. Maybe you all can help me. But it doesn't seem like Arnold Hutschnecker served as Nixon's psychiatrist. And the story goes on and on and on, where people have made all kinds of assumptions and all kinds of stories about the Eisenhower presidency and the Nixon's vice presidency that are just foolish. So I hope that those of you that will read my book will get some kind of at least the idea of what really happened according to the fact pattern. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoy the work, and if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to take them.
Thank you, Irv. Our first question is in the back row.
You mentioned that you were writing a new book regarding JFK and Richard Nixon, and I was curious if you might be able to tell us any advice or research that you had on the first presidential debate between the 2 of them, if you had any thoughts regarding that.
The question, if any of you didn't hear it, is what am I doing in my next book, and what kind of information do I have on the first debate? The answer is yes. I am already working on the next book of Nixon versus Kennedy, and my agent and my editor have already called me up and said, where am I at writing the next volume? I said, I'm in Yorba Linda giving a speech. They said, I don't care. But the answer to your question is, my first father-in-law was Horace Schwerin, who did the private side of the Nielsen ratings. He did advertising ratings. The corporation was called SCR. And one of the things I'm going to be stating about the debates is not that Kennedy won the debates or Nixon lost the debates, but debates had a certain ability to draw, all things being equal, people closer together. So the nature of what happened in the debates was not that one guy was better than the other, but by Kennedy being there and being on the same screen, it evened out the contest somewhat because he had the same kind of media exposure.
Before we get to our next question, I had a quick question. How active a policy role did President Nixon or Vice President Nixon have within the Eisenhower administration?
By the way, for you, this is Jonathan Malvitas standing in the back, who has been a jewel for me and very helpful and has been great. The real story to that, Jonathan, is this. The problem is that Eisenhower took the position that the only person that made the ultimate decisions was the president. So what Nixon ends up doing is being a trusted lieutenant who has all kinds of authorities given to him. And one of the authorities is giving to Richard Nixon, and I hope you don't repeat this because It's going to ruin Nixon's image, and none of you want to see that happen. He was the singular most advocate in promoting civil rights in the 1950s. No one did more to end segregation everywhere, and especially in foreign affairs, because one of Nixon's mantra was, if you cannot preach democracy at home by ending segregation, you cannot preach freedom in the developing countries, because you had to treat all people equally. And Richard Nixon was one of the great proponents in the 1950s of leveling the playing field. And so what happened with Nixon, Jonathan, was a series of things. The better he did from 1953 to 1954, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the more authority the president gave him. The problem was that Eisenhower was really difficult to read. He didn't get out there and say, you know, I'm doing this and so is responsible for that. Or I'm doing this and so is responsible for that. What he said was, if anything happens bad, I'm responsible. If anything happens good, the team's responsible. So you don't get Dwight Eisenhower getting out and usually giving anybody praise. I will tell you this. One of the things in the book, when Nixon comes back from his first foreign policy trip in 1953, is a handwritten letter on White House stationery. There may be 4 or 5 of these. And Pat and Richard Nixon got one of them. Lady?
After President Eisenhower's heart attack, how did their relationship change, or did it, as far as President Nixon or Vice President Nixon?
The question was, how did Eisenhower's relationship with Nixon change after Eisenhower's heart attack? I have a whole chapter on that. In addition to the whole chapter on that, not only do I have Eisenhower's problems, but Nixon had problems, because Nixon was being treated for insomnia and for tension. And Nixon was taking a bunch of barbiturates. By the way, so was Dwight Eisenhower. So I really thought this was pretty great. I mean, this was really cool. I had these guys nailed, you know, and I had them both seeing Dr. Feelgood. You know, they were precursors to Elvis Presley. So I talked to 2 doctors who practiced in 1956 and a pharmacist that practiced in 1956, and they both said to me, "Nah, this wasn't a big deal. This is the way we treated people in the 1950s. Boy, did they bust my bubble."
We have a question in the 4th row.
Hello, Professor Gellman. I was actually a student of yours at Chapman University when the Contender came out, and really enjoyed it, and you brought us here as students to the archives. It was a great experience, and I wrote a paper in your class on Kennedy and Nixon, so I'm looking forward to that. 2-part question: is it going to be another 15 years before we get the next book? And when writing, what percentage would you say is research versus actual writing and putting pen to paper?
The first part of the question I can answer pretty easy. I have a great agent by the name of Alexander C. Hoyt, and I have a great editor by the name of William Fruck. Both of these guys are really miserable human beings. They had me publishing in 2018. And if you don't think I got scars in my back already to get the next book out, you're wrong. The other question, part of the question that you asked, I write very strangely. I memorize documents, and then I put them in order. And then when I see them again in order, and they happen to be topical things, i.e. like there's going to be a chapter on religion. So I'll pull all that out of my head, rewrite it in my head, write it up, and then show it to my wife, who is my first reader. So I don't know if that's kind of strange, but that's the way I do it.
Irv, thank you for doing this and for doing the Contender. And as far as I know, none of your books on Richard Nixon have ever been challenged for fact or for accuracy, so congratulations on that. You're one of a series of new books on Richard Nixon. What do you attribute this new look at Richard Nixon? Is the world ready to look favorably and more positively on him after all these years?
That was Sandy Quinn, who, by the way, started working for Richard Nixon in 1962. And he walks around with a series of dogs. And at one point in time, he would have put a collar on me and walked me around also as one of his dogs. But I balked when he wanted me to eat the dog food. But to answer the question, one of my friends is Evan Thomas. And he has a new book out, which is partly I agree with and partly I don't agree with. Jack Farrell is coming out with Doubleday next year on this. Luke Nichter and Douglas Brinkley are doing the tapes. And there's a pretty ugly book out by a guy named Tim Weiner called One Man Against the World. I think that Nixon is becoming more and more acceptable from the standpoint that he wasn't the ogre that he is made out to be. That more and more people are understanding he was a complicated, complex person with a whole series of positives and a series of negatives. But some people, just between us and C-SPAN and 100 million people, there are some people that just hate this guy. So, example, in the Tim Weiner book, which I normally don't comment on, so don't tell anybody I am, he's got a section in there where Weiner says that John Ehrlichman said that he refused to work for Nixon in the 1960 election unless he promised that he wouldn't drink. I'm going, this is the first time that John Ehrlichman ever worked for Richard Nixon. So I called up General Donald Hughes, Nixon's appointment secretary during the 60 election and his appointment secretary from 57 to 61, and said, Don, how often did John Ehrlichman see Nixon in the 1960 election? And Don said, maybe 5 minutes. Now, maybe you have a better understanding of a guy running for president than I do. But a guy who sees you for 5 minutes and somebody says he's giving an ultimatum that he's not going to work for him unless he stays sober is kind of nutty. Oh, by the way, I also checked the guy's footnote. It never happened.
We have a question in the third row.
In talking about the checker speech and the interaction between Eisenhower and Nixon, I believe in the Sixth Crisis in his biography, Nixon had stated in he had a conversation with Eisenhower when he felt that Eisenhower hadn't made the decision, and he allegedly said something. In your research, is this fact or is this another fiction?
Yeah, he
or
said
what is the content?
he said shit or get off the pot.
Yeah.
That's what you're very pleasantly saying. Yes.
Yeah.
Eisenhower calls Richard Nixon in the evening when he's getting ready to return from, I think, Seattle back to L.A. to prepare his speech. And at one point in time, Eisenhower says to Nixon, you're really having a hard time. This is a problem, and there are these kind of problems, et cetera, et cetera. And Nixon, your brother, says to Eisenhower, sometimes, General, you got to shit or get off the pot. Now, they've cleaned it up a number of ways, but the real story, that's the real story.
We have a question in the back row.
Earl Warren, former governor, former Chief Justice. I understand, he ran with Dewey in 48. I understand that there was animosity between Nixon and Eisenhower over the 52 convention, that Nixon outdid him on that convention train to Chicago. Would you speak to that?
Sure I can. It's untrue. What happened was that Nixon went to the convention where they were doing the platform. He met the train as it was coming in, I believe, to Denver, the Warren train. And Nixon went on the Warren train and said, it's going to be a contest between Eisenhower and Taft. and told Warren that. The story is that Warren felt that Nixon was trying to work him over for the nomination. Again, I don't know how many lawyers I have in the audience or anything like that, but the primary law in 1952 said that until the favored son releases the delegation had to vote for the favored son, who was Earl Warren. And just for your own information, Earl Warren never released the California delegation. It never was a unanimous vote for Dwight Eisenhower because Warren didn't let it happen.
Thank you very much, Irv. Please give Irv Gellman a round of applause.
Thank you.
Irv will be in the lobby to sign your books. Thank you, everyone for coming. Please come back for Dick Cheney next week at 9/11. Thank you very much.